So I mentioned to you how important the Ideas in American Policing lecture series is to all of us here at the National Policing Institute. This is not only a tradition that goes back more than 26 years when this series first began, but it is a series that we believe has been influential within the profession of policing. And I'll just mention to you a couple of the Ideas in American Policing lectures and papers that we've seen over the years. So in 1998, the second Ideas in American Policing paper and lecture was authored by Larry Sherman. The title of that paper was Evidence-Based Policing. And to our knowledge, that is the first time that the phrase evidence-based policing was published within policing, is in that Ideas in American Policing paper. Other notable folks that you all may recognize having published in the IAP series include Steve Mostrovsky. David Weisberg published his paper on place-based policing. Cynthia Lum, another one of our board members, also published her paper in 2009 on translating police research into practice. Dr. Anthony Braga, who many of you know, published on embedded criminologists in police departments. And Jerry Ratcliffe also published on harm-focused policing. In fact, one of the last two Ideas in American Policing papers that we published. Today, we're here to hear from Dr. Dennis Rosenbaum on the 21st Ideas in American Policing paper around fixing the crisis of legitimacy in policing by measuring what matters. And he will tell you more about that here in just a minute. Let me take a moment and introduce Dr. Rosenbaum to all of you. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for many, many years. I was thinking last night about I think the first time that I heard one of his remarks was at a New England Regional Police Chiefs Association, where he talked about the National Police Research Platform, which he founded and led to really a tremendous success around the country. More than 100 agencies were participating in that police research platform, really producing a number of very, very interesting papers, including one that I think was co-authored by Pew Research Center on what police believe and communities believe, talking about the similarities and the differences between them. But Dr. Rosenbaum had served as the head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, the Director of Graduate Studies, and the Director of the Center for Research in Law and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's also served as the Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at the University at Albany, SUNY. In 2014, Dr. Rosenbaum was elected as the first chair of the new Division of Policing within the American Society of Criminology. And in this capacity, he created an ad hoc committee to the President's 21st Century Policing Task Force, which submitted a series of recommendations from leading police scholars to improve policing in the United States. Dr. Rosenbaum is a fellow in the Academy of Experimental Criminology within the American Society of Criminology. His areas of research expertise include procedural justice, which you'll hear about today, as well as impartial policing, community crime prevention, police accountability, and many other areas within the profession. From 2015 to 2023, Dr. Rosenbaum served as the compliance officer for the settlement agreement between the United States Department of Justice and the City of Portland, Oregon. And from 2018 to 2022, Dr. Rosenbaum served as the Associate Monitor for Impartial Policing on the Independent Monitoring Team for the City of Chicago's consent decree. So we are absolutely grateful for his willingness to do this paper and willingness to be here today to share his lecture with all of you, which again, we're recording, we'll post on YouTube for everyone to hear. So without further delay, I'll ask Dr. Rosenbaum to join us here at the podium. Please welcome Dr. Rosenbaum.
Make sure my phone is turned off. Thank you. Oh, well, not a good start. First of all, it's great to have all of you here, and I look forward to our discussion afterwards. I want to thank the National Policing Institute and President Jim Birch in particular for inviting me and allowing me to share some of my ideas in American policing. Also Jim's excellent team here, folks put this together, so they deserve credit for making this happen. And, NPI has this long and commendable history that Jim's mentioned of supporting evidence-based policing and translational criminology. And so I'm proud to be part of that tradition, and I appreciate this honor. Before I get started, I feel a need to say that my criticism of law enforcement is directed largely at police organizations, not at individual police officers. You know, most officers are doing a very difficult job. They're staying within policy and within the training guidelines they've received and the supervision they've received. And my hope is that some of these organizational changes that I'm proposing will someday reduce the stress that police officers feel, both inside the agency they work for and out on the streets. So let me get started. I guess I'm in charge of this here now. Are these the questions for today? All right, it did work. Here are the main questions I'm going to try to deal with. What do we mean by legitimacy? Why is there a crisis of police legitimacy today? Why have past reforms failed to really reform policing? And finally, what can be done to improve policing? Legitimacy and police effectiveness. So let's get started here. What is legitimacy? One good definition by Fagan and Tyler, it's based on historical work, is that legitimacy is a quality possessed by an authority, a law, or an institution that leads others to feel obligated to obey its decisions and directives. Now, more specifically, my friend Tom Tyler defines police legitimacy in terms of whether the public believes that the police are acting in the best interest of the community. In other words, do we have trust and confidence that they will do the right thing, so to speak? So, you know, I want to stress here, police authority is not defined entirely by the badge, the gun, the arrest powers they have been given, but police action must be authorized by the consent of the governed, if you will. So legitimacy can be granted, it can be taken away. We've seen that happen because it's defined by the hearts and minds of the public. Do they believe in and trust the police? That's what we're talking about. So the crisis of legitimacy, as you know, police legitimacy has suffered a substantial blow in the last few years. You know, after Ferguson in 2014, the President's task force underscored the importance of trust. And this is the first line in their report. And here's the co-author of the report right here in the front. Let me read this. Trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve is essential in a democracy. It is key to the stability of our communities, the integrity of our criminal justice system, and the safe and effective delivery of police services. So that tells you how important trust is. It raised a lot of questions about what factors undermine public trust and police legitimacy. So I've covered a lot of these factors in my essay, but you know, for more than a century, the police maintained order through street justice, if you will. I think you know what that means. Unfortunately, we still see a few of these cases in our time, from Rodney King to Tyree Nichols in 1991 to 2023. And for many decades, there was serious, a long time ago, police corruption and scandals in big cities. It's all well documented. So our nation has this, also I want to stress, a long history of racism in policing. After the slave patrols, southern cities demanded that police departments enforce a series of Jim Crow laws that I'm sure you're familiar with over the next century, 100 years. So their image has been tainted for a long time, and the persistent racism in our society eventually led to the civil rights movement that took off in the 60s, and the police response was problematic there. We don't have time to review it. Actually, there's been quite a long history of mishandling racial conflict and protests, all the way from the 1919 incidents in Chicago all the way to the present. And that's all well documented as well. Most recently, the biggest concern, and the one I'm concerned about, is the impact of enforcement on vulnerable and disadvantaged groups. People of color, the poor, the homeless, crime victims, persons with mental health problems or physical disabilities, those with limited English proficiency, young people, the LGBTQ+ community, the Jewish and Muslim communities, they've all reported negative encounters with the police in the United States. Also, we know that the police, despite their strong image of crime fighting, have not been all that effective at preventing and solving many crimes, with the exceptions of hotspots policing, which has been shown to be effective. But if those of you know my writings, you'll also see how I saw it as problematic and how it's actually carried out, not in experiments done by my friends, but in the day-to-day policing in various departments. Currently, speaking of crime control, police are solving only about half of all the homicides that we know of, about a third of all violent crime, and only 1/4 of all sexual assaults. So it's harder to deter crime and keep victims happy when we don't have the administration of justice. Another big thing I want to stress here before we get into the rest of this, unnecessary enforcement. It's a big deal today. You know, we've witnessed a massive number of pretextual traffic stops where drivers are stopped for minor violations such as expired registration or broken taillight in order to look for more serious criminal activity such as illegal drugs and guns. Now, these stops unfortunately have very little to do with public safety, and they're not associated with accidents or death on the highway, and they rarely lead to illegal drugs or weapons. We have many studies of that, but for example, one highway patrol conducted 400,000 searches that yielded only 17 cases of drugs and guns. So that left 399,983 drivers stopped for what reason, and how were they treated? Presumably there was some suspicion. I thank Malcolm Gladwell for that example. Police stops and searches, in a nutshell, they're also associated with racial disparities. We have data on this. Use of force, negative sentiment toward the police from the community. So communities of color have reason to be more fearful of the police, and in fact they are more fearful. Similarly, the mass number of pedestrian stops, or what we call SQFs, stop, question, and frisk, are problematic. According to a meta-analysis by David Weisberg and his colleagues in 2022, yes, they did find some limited crime reduction benefits, but they were not worth the larger cost in terms of the negative mental and physical health effects, as well as the negative attitudes toward the police. And again, other studies show racial disparities in these pedestrian stops. So traffic and pedestrian stops are especially harmful to vulnerable communities. That's all I'm pointing out at this point. And legitimacy over the years has not been helped by the many reform commissions created to investigate police misconduct over the past century. There have been many, by the way, as well as consent decrees starting in the 1990s and the negative media coverage of these investigations. And so, not surprising, the police aren't happy with all the criticism, all the complaints, and as a result, they're now disengaging in some ways. We do see depolicing, and many are even leaving the police force. So there's problems. But what have we done to increase police legitimacy? Let's talk about that. Is this the right one? Yes. So lately we've seen a lot of efforts to enhance legitimacy. I've covered these briefly in my essay. I won't review all of them here. But I've argued that these reforms have been ineffective at changing the street-level behaviors that are most important to the community. Some of these reforms are great ideas. You know, I love community policing, for example. I've written books about it, done many studies, but they're often poorly implemented or they use the wrong data systems to ensure their effectiveness. They aren't integrated fully into the day-to-day policing. Also, accountability programs. You know, there's always talk of accountability and transparency. They tend to focus on punishment. And as a psychologist, I can tell you that punishment is not the way to go. That's a whole nother talk. Another reason for the limited impact is that management has yet to piece together all these separate reform programs and refocus the police culture on what's important to the community. You know, so after observing police for nearly a half century, I hate to admit that I'm that old, I see no compelling evidence that these reforms have changed the quasi-military police culture of the warriors who are fighting to protect society from the evil forces, or that management has changed its obsession with a few law enforcement metrics to measure success, such as citations, arrests, and seizures. So from my perspective, there's two main problems with police reform that I want to emphasize. First, there's the failure to measure what matters most to the community, namely how they're treated by the police, or what we call procedural justice. Yes, the public cares about reducing crime, that's been shown, but they care more about how they're treated by the police. So police do not exist just to protect us. They exist to serve us as well. And please don't forget important statistics. The vast majority of their time is consumed by non-crime incidents. Only about 1/3 of their calls for service involve any type of criminal activity, and even then, procedural justice matters, including arrests. So today, I will spend my time talking about the elements of procedural justice. In addition, I will introduce you to the social science research that explains effective interpersonal communication consistent with the call for evidence-based policing. And second, and perhaps most importantly to reform, is the failure of police organizations to change their systems of management and accountability. You know, many of my academic colleagues talk about and write about procedural justice. I'm guilty of, I do that as well. But we say very little about the need to integrate these metrics into the day-to-day management of police organizations. This is critical, so I think I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The most important words that I can say to you today are these. If you don't measure something in an agency, it doesn't matter. If you do measure something and you treat it as important, employees will immediately take notice and likely take action. Here's one recent example. In 2022, the Los Angeles Police Department started to require officers to explain the reasons they decided to make pretextual traffic stops. Guess what? Pretextual stops decreased in frequency and stops for moving violations increased. How interesting. Let's move on to the principles. Here's the basic 4 principles of procedural justice as applied to police-public encounters. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. Basically, procedurally just policing involves treating people with dignity and respect, giving them voice, remaining neutral or unbiased in decision-making, and conveying trustworthy motives. In a few minutes, I'm going to drill down on these principles so you can see the social psychological process at work. But first, I do want to say that, over the years, many times police officers have said to me, Professor Rosenbaum, this procedural justice stuff, it's interesting, it's a nice idea, but there's no way I can get a positive review after I've given someone a ticket. It's not going to happen, I'm giving them a punishment. Well, I tested that hypothesis, and if you look at this table, you'll see, here's in 3 cities, I measured their procedural justice and what I call car-side manners after they gave the driver a ticket. What you see here, only the traffic tickets, only stops where traffic tickets were issued. Now, yes, the officers are right in the sense that giving a ticket does lower their ratings. That's not shown here, but overall, actually the dotted line or the line across the middle there, only 42% of drivers on average were satisfied with the treatment they received when they were issued a ticket. That's the dotted line. But look at the massive differences between officers who treated the drivers in a procedurally just manner and those who did not when issuing a ticket. If the officer listened to the driver and was polite, that's the red bars, the driver was about 60 to 62% satisfied with the encounter. But when officers did not listen, was not polite, the blue bars, wow, satisfaction dropped to 8 or 5%. So, car-side manners do make a difference when issuing a ticket. Procedural justice communicates, it makes a huge difference. You can get a 60% approval rating or a 5%. All right. Another thing I get criticized or hear from critics is they tell me that we're prioritizing procedural justice over public safety. You can't have both. We're going to do one or the other. And they often tell me our job's fighting crime, not customer service. All right, so let's be clear here. The police, they do not have to choose between the two, procedural justice and public safety. In fact, we have good evidence that they're related. Research shows here that when the police are viewed as lacking procedural justice, community members are more disobedient and resistant, more disrespectful, more at risk of force and violence, more cynical about the law, less likely to obey the law, and less likely to cooperate with the police. Now, these last two are especially important. Public safety is undermined when the police don't have good partners in the fight against crime. They need the cooperation of informants, witnesses, victims. They need strong relationships, partnerships with local community groups, etc. And I've written about this partnership stuff for years. All right, so let me move on. I'm proposing here 2 new systems of measurement to achieve real reform: context surveys and body-worn cameras. Neither of these are new, as you know, but they need to be used in new ways to collect the necessary data about procedural justice and interpersonal communication. As I noted in my essay, context surveys need to be collected from community members immediately after contact with an officer, not a year later, and they need to be collected all the time for certain groups, perhaps starting with victims of crime and drivers and traffic stops. We need to create data collection systems, not a one-time report, as I've done and many other people have done. Body-worn cameras, I am delighted that so many departments now have them. The 70 largest departments all have them. What I'm asking is that we begin to use this massive, rich database for more than its current usage, which is typically only officer-involved shootings or serious complaints. And when now some sergeants are being told, take a look at a couple hours of body-worn camera data every week, randomly. We need to look systematically at the other 99% of context between police and community members. Why the arrows? Because the 2 data sets need to be linked, as I'll talk about in a moment. But first, let's talk about procedural justice in greater detail, communication skills, and what needs to be analyzed with these 2 new systems. Let's start with respectful treatment. All human beings, we know this for a fact, have a psychological need to be treated with dignity and respect during interpersonal encounters, including interactions with authority figures like the police. Regardless of the circumstances, no one wants to be embarrassed, humiliated, demeaned, or dismissed, especially in the presence of other people. As a social psychologist, I can say with confidence that people interact with other human beings for a reason. We all want social support and social approval. We want validation of our feelings. We try hard to create a sense of self-worth, a sense of pride about who we are. I'm somebody. I'm a police officer. I'm a professor. I'm a government official. I'm a high school football player. So we don't ever want to be embarrassed in front of our friends or family. It pops a hole in our self-perception balloon. So police officers and all of us need to be careful about what we say to others in social settings, especially young people, by the way, who are still forming their identity. After logging many, many hours with police officers, I would say that most interactions with the public are respectful, but some are best described as unfortunate misuses of authority. Yelling at someone in a group, hey, you, get over here, versus, hey, do you mind if I talk to you for a minute? Could you please come over here? Some disrespectful comments are more serious. One time I was riding with police in a large city that will remain unnamed. We responded to a call. It was well after midnight. It was a sexual assault call. Actually, it was a rape call. And the minute we got out of the car and approached the rape victim, the first thing out of this officer's mouth was, what the hell did you think would happen to you dressed like that at 1 in.the morning? I looked at him like, rather than saying, I'm sorry this happened, can you give me some details? Now, one incident here. Research in the United States, as well as other countries, especially Britain, have repeatedly documented that the treatment of rape victims by law enforcement is not good, as many officers rely on stereotypes, like society does too, that lead to distrusting and blaming the victims, resulting in non-cooperation and very few convictions. So it's linked to crime as well. Even when the police interact with the most disrespectful people and with suspects and arrestees, we need officers to be firm, but to be the bigger person and set an example. Remember that interpersonal communication is interactive, and each action has a reaction, what social psychologists call the norm of reciprocity. Yes, we have positive and negative norms of reciprocity. The positive norm says essentially that you should respond to a positive action with another positive action. When someone does something nice to you, there is a feeling of gratitude and a need for social repayment, which contributes to equity in relationships, cooperation, keeps our society functioning smoothly. If you're friendly, polite, respectful, the person you're interacting with will be much more likely to respond in the same way. On the other hand, if you respond in a negative or hostile way, you can expect the same in return. We call this negative reciprocity. I've watched this happen many times with police and observed how tension escalates as they exchange disrespectful comments. Many officers actually assume that their legal authority requires that the community give them respect. No, it does not work that way. Respect depends on what happens in the interaction. So what's the implication? Given our social psychological need to maintain our human dignity as social beings, police should try hard to show respect and kindness to all individuals unless facing life-threatening circumstances. The payoff will be worth it. Let's go on to the next principle, giving voice. When you look at the research in psychology on efficacy, and there's a lot of it, or more recently, any feminist publications, you'll see that human beings seek to be autonomous agents who are self-governing and self-efficacious. So we want to be in control of ourselves, make decisions on our own, and be in control of our immediate environment as human beings. This makes a lot of sense. Historically, it had evolutionary value. It makes us feel safe, makes our world predictable, makes us feel good about ourselves. You know, if you want to see some overwhelming evidence of the importance of voice and self-efficacy, just go online, look at TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, or for many of us here, LinkedIn. We can see how many people looked at my website. You can see people searching for you. You can see people congratulating you after you've told them you just got promoted. We all care about what our images are. So officers and have our voice must be careful. Their actions do not suppress this desire for agency unless absolutely necessary. So related to voice, by the way, is the importance of providing explanations for your actions. When authority figures don't explain themselves, when they ask or tell someone to do something but don't explain why, the person becomes angry and upset. It reminds me of kids and parents when the kid says, "Why do I have to do that?" And the parent says, "Because I told you so. Now go do it," as opposed to giving an explanation. Now, so given the fundamental psychological need for identity, for efficacy, for control and expression in human beings, police should attempt to give voice to others whenever possible through active listening, and they should explain their actions. Let's move on to neutrality. Now, this third core principle, procedural justice, fairness, neutrality, it's really at the heart of the criminal justice system, right? It's arguably the central issue regarding the exercise of authority by the police. For the public, fairness is knowing that the officer is applying the law fairly, that their decisions and actions are based on all relevant and available information and on legal procedures, not on their personal opinions or their personal biases. Today, community members, as you probably know, are especially concerned that police are basing their decisions on factors such as the person's race or ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, religion, or other extra-legal factors. We have lots of research indicating that fairness matters enormously to the public. However, being fair is extremely hard to do because research also shows that all of us are biased in some way. Hard for us to believe, but it's true. But that doesn't excuse us, my point, from working hard to minimize the behavioral effects of our implicit and explicit biases. So the implication, officers should be aware of human bias and public fear of bias, and make every effort to stick to the facts and try hard also during training sessions not to be defensive about bias training. I've been through a lot of those and people get defensive. I'm not biased, I'm not racist. We all are. Okay, let's move to trustworthiness. The fourth and final component of procedural justice. The evidence suggests that public responds favorably to officers who are viewed as trustworthy. That is, officers whose motives are to do the right thing rather than to harm or retaliate against the public or simply ignore their needs. You know, people want to interact with officers who seem concerned about their needs and take them very seriously. You know, my own research in 53 large cities suggests that trustworthiness is a consequence of procedural justice rather than a component of it. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we get there? What can police officers do to come across as trustworthy? Let's look at some aspects of this process that are based on solid research, although this is not included in the original procedural justice model. Perhaps the most important thing for gaining someone's trust is empathy and compassion, especially in stressful situations. We think of empathy as the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from their point of view or their situation. Here's what we know about expressions of empathy. The evidence suggests that when people feel that others are able to see their point of view and show concern for their feelings, they feel better. And they're more likely to trust and respect the individual showing empathy. However, conversely, the evidence shows that they resent people who do not show empathy. The bottom line is that empathy is a real and important psychological process that can have a positive impact on relationships. Our research, for example, in large cities shows that when police officers are perceived as having empathy, the public views them as more trustworthy, and consequently, they're more willing to cooperate with the police. Because of its importance, I've added empathy as a component of procedural justice, but achieving empathy is a complex psychological process. Here's 3 steps I'll talk about. So remember, the police are not just interacting with typical strangers. Sometimes the community member is suffering from a traumatic victimization or a car accident, or is having a mental health crisis, or is living with some physical disabilities such as autism, or has limited English proficiency, or they're simply scared to death because a police officer has stopped them with lights flashing and they have no idea why. There are sizable literatures in the fields of communication, social work, education, linguistics, developmental psychology, and psychotherapy that deal with the issue of compassionate communication, empathy, and perspective taking during one-on-one encounters. So here, as I point out, empathy can be conceptualized as a 3-step psychological process. First, to have empathy, you must notice what the other person is experiencing. That requires that you be aware, open, and receptive to what's going on, that you evaluate all the information available to you. The second process is connecting to that individual. This should involve both emotional and cognitive components. The emotional is the feeling. You must try to feel what they feel. From Greek philosophy, the word compassion is translated as to suffer with. There's also the cognitive component. You can turn to various studies on perspective taking and emotional intelligence. This research is all about developing a cognitive skill set that allows you to recognize other people's mental states, to recognize the hidden meaning behind what they're saying, to anticipate their actions, to be aware of your own emotions, and be aware of your own impact on someone. Wow, that's a lot. But on a positive note, I can tell you, for example, that research on prejudice shows that trying to take on someone else's perspective has been shown to reduce stereotypes of outgroups, increase helping behavior, and reduce implicit bias. Finally, the third set of processes for achieving compassionate communication and showing empathy involves responding. You can't just notice and connect. You need to do something. Compassion requires action, such as emotional support, advice, practical assistance. You must do whatever you can within your own time, resources, and skills to alleviate the person's pain or suffering. This might include expressing sympathy and providing advice about local services. And your response is also the point where emotional intelligence comes into play. What impact did my empathic response have on the person? And then respond appropriately. The bottom line, this stuff is complex, but if we don't think about it this way and draw upon what is known in the scientific literature, we'll be unable to help officers respond appropriately and effectively. So the implication here, officers should be trained and supervised to strengthen their emotional and cognitive skills in order to demonstrate empathy. Start by active listening, spending time in other person's environment, interviewing people different from yourself, observing them, and practicing empathy. I'll come back to that at some point. All right. Now, at a more superficial level, but still important, I'm adding conversational etiquette into the procedural justice equation. It's a set of rules or practices regarding appropriate behavior in interpersonal settings. Most of you know these rules and follow them, but I know some people who don't. All social interaction should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. At the beginning, you need to introduce yourself, give your name, explain the purpose of your presence if necessary. Actually, most of the time we end up shaking, but you don't always shake hands with people in policing. We don't need to. In the middle, you need to listen to the other person speak, as we just talked about today. You need to wait for your turn to speak, called turn taking. Then you exit the conversation with some closure, thanking the person, saying goodbye, wishing them well. You can't just walk away. I actually know people who do that. They just walk away. Also, during the interaction, you engage in something important, if necessary. It's called conversational repair. This means that you're paying attention and you're aware that something isn't going right in the conversation. For example, the person's clearly mad at you because they misunderstood you due to a language barrier. Or you interrupted the person and they're upset about losing their voice. After you become aware of the problem, you need to make a genuine effort to fix or repair it. For example, you might say, "I'm sorry for interrupting. Go ahead and finish what you were saying about your neighbor." Or you might say, "I'm sorry if I offended you and you think I'm blaming you. I didn't mean to imply that." This is emotional intelligence at work. What's the implication? All adults are expected to follow the rules of conversational etiquette. And more, actually. Research suggests that failure to follow these norms will lead to negative sentiment and social rejection. Now, granted, some settings are fast-moving in policing and don't allow the police to follow social etiquette, but these situations are rare. And some officers, I've seen this happen, use their differential power to skirt or ignore these social rules in non-threatening situations. But they will pay a price in terms of procedural justice sentiment for that reaction. All right, miscommunication. All this talk of interpersonal communication sounds good, but as I suggested a moment ago, people miscommunicate all the time. Verbal and nonverbal behaviors each send messages to the recipient, and sometimes messages received are not what the sender intended, or the sender meant to hide the real feelings but was unsuccessful. Facial expressions, hand movements can affect the receiver's interpretation of verbal statements. Frowning, eyes rolling, head shaking, looking at your watch. Miscommunication is another reason we need both context surveys and body-worn cameras to find out what's really going on during the encounter. So let me summarize the unique benefits of these methodologies I'm proposing. These two methods can explain and validate each other. For example, when certain officers receive high procedural justice ratings from the community, we can look at the body-worn camera data to see why. What did they do that resulted in such strong performance ratings? Importantly, the surveys give voice to members of the community, which they want, those with lived police experience, not just the people in the community, the 4 out of 5 that have no police contact. And the body-worn cameras will give voice to officers indirectly because they're talking there. These systems will definitely advance our understanding of police legitimacy, helping us to identify the factors that enhance or undermine public trust in the police. And as I'll explain in a minute, these two data systems can provide the foundation for a new system of police accountability. Okay, the time has come to analyze these millions of hours of body-worn camera footage and identify patterns related to procedural justice, communication, and public trust. So we need to look at that 99% of footage that we haven't looked at. Let's be clear. Human beings are physically incapable of doing this type of analysis by themselves. So they must turn to artificial intelligence for this job. Now, I know that's a scary idea these days, as artificial intelligence is about to take over our whole world and do everything for us. But we need to roll up our sleeves and get ahead of this curve in the policing field. Now, a few companies are beginning this pioneering work, like Polis Inc., using natural language processing and computer vision to analyze body-worn camera footage. And the National Policing Institute here is also involved in field testing AI, and that's really important. We still have a long ways to go, however. I also want to credit the National Institute of Justice, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, as well as some private foundations for funding preliminary research in this area. And I want to thank the few police departments that are participating now, and those that will be brave enough to participate in the near future. I can assure you we'll be on the cutting edge of innovation, and the payoff will be incredible. But we need to proceed in an orderly manner here. First, we need to engage the community, the police, researchers, and AI experts in the planning process, as the National Policing Institute has done in Dallas. We need to agree on the dimensions of procedural justice and interpersonal communication that we believe are important and therefore worthy of measurement. We can give guidance to AI when it comes to measuring specific constructs. I'll just take one example, giving voice. If an officer on the body-worn camera doesn't speak at all or speaks very rarely, is that officer giving voice to the civilian? Maybe. They're not doing all the talking. Or is the officer showing disinterest in the conversation? Not enough interest to say anything. Perhaps the officer needs to show curiosity with words, such as, "That's interesting, can you tell me more?" Or, "Can you tell me why that happened?" Both rewarding the person for talking and encouraging more voice. So we might assign different levels of giving voice. Words like why and how could be important and help build rapport during an interview. And of course, respect might be measured with complimentary words and disrespect with critical words or foul language, such as the initial study at the University of Chicago did. I also think we should measure helpfulness and kindness, which could indicate empathy. For example, did the officer provide the name and phone number of the social services relevant to the individual's problems, whether they be temporary housing or domestic violence centers? Or asking, is there anything I can do to help? So AI can be used to analyze this data and identify patterns in both verbal and nonverbal communication with human guidance and oversight, which is critical. The exciting part, for researchers at least, is to look at patterns in procedural justice and other communication skills. Are certain behaviors related to certain outcomes? And here I just list some examples of whether certain procedural justice behaviors are related to certain outcomes. No doubt they will be. Do some behaviors diffuse or escalate tension, build more trust? We might discover that the best predictor of escalating behavior is whether the officer was disrespectful with words or actions. Or perhaps the civilian started the escalation with noncompliance and foul language, but the officer finished it with an arrest that may or may not have been necessary, depending on the circumstances. Clearly, there's more variables at play, and the back and forth dynamics have yet to be determined. Okay, this really, interpersonal communication can be extremely complex. So here I've added to the chart both the context in which it encounters and the demographics of the participant, the two boxes on top. In terms of individual characteristics, we have to consider the demographics of both the officer and the civilian involved: race, ethnicity, sex, age, gender, identity, English proficiency, etc. These can all have an impact on the behavior of one or more individuals. In my own research, for example, we found that when officer and civilians have matching demographics on age and gender and race, they're more likely to see positive procedural justice scores than when they have mismatches. I take, with one big exception, young males. Apparently, when there's too much testosterone at work, when a young male officer faces a young male civilian, they don't get along. Female officers, on the other hand, match up very nicely on procedural justice. I'm guessing there might be age differences based on different groups that we are involved in. The use of certain words could be miscommunicated across different generations. For example, using slang, a Gen X civilian might say to a new Gen Z officer, "You seem like a headbanger." The officer responds defensively, "I would never harm anyone unless they deserved it," not knowing the civilian is referring to heavy metal music lovers when using the term headbangers. Or a young officer might say to one of us boomers, "He's dope," and we might respond, "Oh no, he doesn't use dope, he's clean." So in terms of context, there are many variables to consider. What is the level of poverty in the neighborhood? What's the level of crime and disorder? Did the encounter occur in a hotspot of crime? Are the police responding to an intense domestic violence incident or making a traffic stop? That's a big difference. How long did the encounter last? So for this information, we can use both the department's record management system, RMS, or metadata, which for body-worn cameras is becoming a big deal. Now, down the road, I expect that AI will be able to sharply distinguish between individual officers, actually, in their style of communication and interaction with other human beings. For example, Officer A may be good at communicating with all types of individuals. Officer B does well with most individuals, but has difficulty when communicating with younger Latino males. Officer C is good at communicating with young people, but doesn't do well with older people. Officer D does well with most groups, except when confronted with someone he considers disrespectful, and then his ego is quickly bruised and he feels the need to exert his authority and threaten the person with punishment, unlike the other officers who can brush it off. So I'm suggesting that our knowledge base will expand exponentially with lots of interaction between variables, and this information can be useful to help officers adjust to different settings. We will learn which procedural justice behaviors also are the strongest predictors of outcomes in general across all officers and all civilians, and therefore should be given more attention within the organization. All right, let's move on to a new accountability system. Time to talk about organizational change. Whether you majored in psychology like me or not, we all know that human behavior is strongly influenced by incentives and disincentives. So the time has come to introduce a new comprehensive accountability system that is built on and incentivizes the new metrics we've discussed. A system that will penetrate the entire police organization and reward desired behaviors on the street. On the positive side, frankly, CompStat was the first system I ever saw that introduced real accountability, that changed street-level behavior. But the drawbacks of this traditional system were numerous. It was usually punitive in nature for commanders and people below them. It led to many people cooking the books because of the pressure to improve their enforcement numbers. And most importantly to us today, it focused exclusively on crime and enforcement statistics. And frankly, we're still stuck with that today for many agencies. However, in spite of its limitations, the general CompStat framework is good in my opinion. The idea of having performance statistics and holding people accountable for improvement, but this time hold the agency accountable for procedural justice and related behaviors. I call it respect stat, call it whatever you want. Now, I'm not the first to suggest that CompStat can be improved. A few years ago, the National Policing Institute here and the Vera Institute of Justice held a symposium on CompStat 2.0 and published several white papers with a strong recommendation of expanding the metrics and engaging the community more. Here, I'm suggesting the best way to engage the community and achieve substantial change is in public trust, is to expand the agency's performance metrics to include the quality of public service and give community members a big voice in the process. By the way, you can't cook the books if the data are collected and analyzed by an outside agency, which I strongly recommend. I'm pushing for procedural justice report cards and specific impact that officers have on service recipients. But I'm not saying abandon crime fighting. As I said, this could improve crime fighting, as I noted earlier. I'm suggesting that agencies do that differently, use better process and outcome metrics. For example, look at the public's level of cooperation with criminal investigations and convictions associated with different levels of procedural justice. And agencies can also monitor sick time, complaints, etc. Just don't stop there. And there are ways to measure actually an agency and individual engagement in community policing, problem-oriented policing, all of which I think are important. There's apps out now. That's a whole nother talk. Within the RespectStat framework, though, clearly agencies should hold accountability meetings to monitor progress on procedural justice. And they should require accountability at all levels of the organization and reward performance within that framework. I know this idea will receive pushback, so we should move forward one step at a time. We should start by emphasizing the benefits to individual officers who are, frankly, tired of the punitive management model. I have my own data on that. In contrast, the focus here is on coaching and mentoring and rewarding exceptional behavior. So focusing on the benefits, here I list some of the benefits, some for the organization, but especially for officers, and how this new system, if implemented properly, it's a big if, would make their jobs easier and more rewarding. So as a result of these procedural justice innovations, the police should experience more successful criminal investigations and crime fighting because they have more cooperation, more cooperative civilians and less use of force, fewer misconduct complaints and discipline problems, improved officer safety and mental health. And that's a big deal today, mental health, and there's research on PTSD, et cetera, in policing. And that would be important. Greater job satisfaction, less cynicism, both about the organization and management and the public, which we have evidence of. Less depolicing and more crime fighting. Fewer protests, negative media stories, lawsuits, defunding campaigns, and all of that, which means there's greater legitimacy overall. So, let's, how we would break down this data. Of course, the analytic work should result in a fancy, user-friendly dashboards, including figures and tables that show breakdowns at many different levels, as shown here. Some of the charts can be used at RespectStat meetings for commanders and other supervisors, such as the first two bullets on this list. And some more specific patterns might be discussed if they occur above the individual officer level. Imagine, for example, that the problem is low procedural justice scores with detectives working the evening shift who show little empathy towards sexual assault victims in particular. And so it's detectives in that one shift with certain types of victims. Imagine another problem with District 5 patrol officers who are disrespectful during traffic stops, but only with drivers under 25 years of age. Be very specific. There's so many ways you can break this down. Now, the job of management is to engage in problem solving, to address specific problems using training and supervision, and to show progress at future RespectStat meetings. I just give this as an example of the type of charts that could be produced at the district or precinct level. These are actually real data that I published in Police Chief Magazine a few years ago. We asked community members in Chicago a bunch of procedural justice questions after their car was stopped or after they called the police regarding a crime. When we asked them at the end, taking the whole experience into account, how satisfied are you with the way you were treated by the officer in this case, on a 4-point scale from very satisfied to very dissatisfied. This is the breakdown of Chicago's 22 police districts, showing the percent who said they were somewhat or very satisfied with how they were treated. You can see huge differences ranging from 46% satisfied in the district on the left side to 92% satisfied in the district on the right side, with a citywide average of 69%, the far left yellow. So this gives an agency and district commanders something to work with at the district level. In theory, you could break this down further. But the bigger point here is simple. Start using new data and build it into organizational management and feedback loops. And structure new incentives that value procedural justice and value strong interpersonal communication skills. Because we're telling the policing field, these are the metrics that matter to the community. Now, organizational changes needed. I mentioned a lot of these in the essay. I'm only going to emphasize a few here. Leadership. The police chief needs to push a new vision of the organization and a clear definition of what constitutes good policing. You can't simply say officers should stay out of trouble and produce some good enforcement statistics. And leaders need to engage senior managers in problem solving and consensus building around this new way of looking at policing, and then send a strong message to everyone else. Use the SARA model of problem-oriented policing, scanning, analysis, response, assessment, to make improvements in procedural justice scores. Now, training, that's one of my pet peeves. Clearly, there's just not enough training on interpersonal communication and procedural justice. Very small dosage at present. We must first, convince recruits of the value of this style of policing and the benefit to them. I listed some of the benefits earlier, but we must go beyond lectures like I'm doing today with talking heads. First, show them what procedural justice actually looks like on the job using videos. Then let them practice doing it in scenarios and record them doing it. Then give them specific feedback on their performance. And finally, have them practice again and again, like how they learn to shoot a weapon. So make procedural justice scores an integral part of performance evaluations as well, and reward officers for strong performance. You can build it into EIS, early intervention systems as well. Supervisors now, all of you know that first-line supervisors are the key to the organizational change, and they play a very important role. Hopefully we can train them to provide good feedback and coaching to their officers using the new metrics. Each officer should receive detailed feedback. Here's where you're doing great. Here's where you need to improve. Here's what I recommend for you. And supervisors need to model the behaviors we're expecting of officers. We surveyed over 15,000 officers in 88 large cities. I can tell you that in agencies where supervisors are viewed as unfair or not supportive, i.e. where there's low organizational justice, morale is low, officers don't want to help management achieve any of their goals, and they don't want to follow the rules themselves. Actually, I have a plaque in my office that says, "The beatings will continue until morale improves." Same applies to procedural justice. You can't say the beatings will continue until procedural justice improves. You need to model the behavior yourself. All right, there's internal audits and evaluation unit. These guys will plan the respect stat meetings, work with the outside agencies to prepare reports, monitor progress over time. Yay for the research team. Recruitment and selection. My final suggestion for organizational change before I stop talking. Agencies will be more successful if they start out with the right people. So let's end at the beginning with recruitment and selection of officers. Let's see. I'm probably supposed to be processing this. Did I send? No, I'm still on the same. First, I just want to say that policing is a very difficult job, and our expectations of them are so high because they handle so many unique and sensitive situations. They interact with so many different types of people. We hold them to a very high standard. So are these expectations realistic? Maybe not. But my point is that many police officers can do better during encounters with the public than we're doing now. And agencies, frankly, will need to perform better in the future. Or they run the risk of pressure to transfer more police work to other agencies, as we see happening with the creation of civilian units nationwide to handle mental health calls. So when hiring, we should continue to exclude applicants who are severely troubled. That goes on now. There's lots of testing. I say maybe add the narcissistic personality disorder to the list of tests. You can look that one up if you want. But we should give more attention to including the right people, not excluding people. Those who have the best chance of being responsive to some of the high expectations that I have laid out here today. So, recruitment and selection. My first recommendation is for psychological testing is to add emotional intelligence. You heard me talk about it. We need officers who can read other people's emotions and respond appropriately. Now, also because the problems of bias and discrimination that characterize the latest crisis of legitimacy, because they have hindered policing for so long, we must also continue to pursue diversity in the police workforce. In this vein, I strongly recommend that we hire more females. In the United States, only 12% of all police officers are females, much lower than other Western countries. We can do better. And why do I care? Again, evidence-based policing. Female officers are better at de-escalating conflict, less likely to use excessive force, and receive fewer complaints from the public. And eventually, when females reach a critical mass in the organization, they could change the current tough guy warrior culture. And promoting more females will speed up this change process. In closing, let's keep hope alive and keep moving forward with demonstration projects to ensure that this approach is feasible and sustainable. And let's remain positive that cities and counties in the United States will continue in their efforts to improve police services and strengthen public trust among all members of the communities they serve. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, but just remember I suffer from low emotional intelligence, low empathy, and maybe a narcissistic personality disorder. So you'll have to forgive me. Yeah, sure, go ahead. Speak up so they can hear you way over there. You don't have a mic on you.
So I just wanted to go back and ask you a question about the empathy.
Yeah.
You mentioned it just then.
Yeah.
And so for those of you who don't know me, I'm a former practitioner in the county police department like Fairfax. But what I wonder about is I don't think that most officers would say, well, I don't want to be empathetic, or they're not right. They're not contrary to it.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's a missing variable here that we're not talking about, which is simply the capacity to be empathetic, because unfortunately a lot of these cops are going to one call after another, and I just wonder if they're if sort of their capacity is being used up for empathy, and it's all in different people have different capacities for it. Not that that's an excuse not to be empathetic, but I wonder if we're not looking at that enough for managing this workload and their own wellness to be able to do that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. We don't know, right? Whether those repeated incidents, we do know, we're beginning to see that police are suffering PTSD from these repeated encounters with stressful events, as any of us would. And so that might inhibit your ability right there. Or maybe it makes you overly sensitive. There's also, related to what you're asking, is a question about whether people in general who have high and low emotional intelligence, is it something you can change? Can some training make you more empathetic, empathic? I think it can. You can even say things like, I'm really sorry that happened to you. And inside I'm thinking, damn it, I'm late for lunch. Now, so that's really not empathy at the deepest level, but it's better than saying, I'm late for lunch. What did you say? So I'm a big fan of trying to train people on this. Now, there are emotional intelligence tests, so you can score high and low on those. And we all know people who are really sensitive to other people and others who are like, don't you get it? He's mad at you. So we vary in that. I just think it's a good question. They do handle a lot of these incidents, but this idea also that police are super, super busy all the time. I mean, I studied Chicago, and I think only a third of their time was spent responding to calls for service. So, there's a lot of free time. It's boring at times. I've been in those cars for hours. But
the related way to test this,
Yeah.
I suppose,
Yeah.
is to use AI and sort of to track these behaviors or empathetic signals throughout a shift, let's say, or throughout like consecutive days working to see, because frankly we don't know, but you can see, are these decreasing at a certain point? Good point. Excellent point. So say officer is in a tough district where he's or she's responding to a number of traumatic events. So, as those go up, does his or her empathy go down, or does it increase, or do they become troubled and can't work anymore? I mean, there's all kinds of, go ahead.
I can just add on to that. There's the study that Mostrovsky and myself and others did in Virginia in 2010, 2011, looking at the predictors of procedural justice and police behavior. And this is actually one of the things we found out, that the more the officer is into the shift, the more encounters they've been through, their level of procedural justice decreases. It was one of the factors that impacted procedural justice.
And you guys that have been in policing, related to that, we all know of the sort of history of writing that says you become hardened over time. Tired. But it also, I think there's a way you want to cut it off, right? Because I can't feel that all the time. Like I was saying, empathy is feeling what they're feeling. No, I felt enough of that today, you know? So that is a problem. Is there a way to deal? These are real issues that should be dealt with and solved. Yeah, this is great. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with all that, but I also think that because of the shortage right now, what we really need to be doing is almost rotation off the front line, much like they do in battle. We only have so much capacity and then it's used up, and we're not being allowed that time to rotate off that front line to refresh ourselves. A lot of it is due to the shortage in policing, but you'll see that about 5 years, I think, is when we typically see
Yeah.
they've reached that point where all of a sudden they know everything, they get on every call, it's all the same, and that's where their empathy really starts to go. You can start rotating people off, get them that refresher, bring them back out. I think we'd see a huge uptick in procedural justice and the empathy.
I think that's a very interesting and a good idea. I mean, also this is reminding me, I shouldn't mention cities in negative ways. So a large city that I worked in, all the recruits, they put them immediately into the toughest neighborhoods. That was also a problem, I think. You know, it's also turned their image hardened them right away. But I think that's there's so many different possibilities. And yeah, there is this problem now. Police are working a lot harder too. So it rotate. The only drawback that I think of that is, you know, many of us who spend a lot of years talking about community policing and all this stuff, we also want officers to get to know neighborhoods. You know, when I testified before your president's task force, you may not remember this, but I focused on foot patrol. Get out of the car, get to know the kids. I mean, the benefit of that is you can tell which kids are the gangbangers, which kids are just wannabes, which ones are good, and you get to know the businesses, all that stuff. You get to, but you know, and most departments keep moving, but not just moving people around. You're saying giving them an easier job for a while.
Yeah, just get them off of being the front line, get them out of uniform.
Yeah.
It could even be a shorter version.
Yes.
But get them out of this persona that they put on. When we put on the uniform, we put on a different persona.
Right.
And once that uniform comes off, then we have the chance to refresh.
Yeah. Good point.
Australia does the sabbatical every 5 years, I think. Right? Is that all there from emotional survival for law enforcement? They do the sabbatical.
Who's doing this? Some people.
Australian.
Oh, interesting. So we could learn from that. Yeah, no, there's no doubt that it's a stressful job. And again, you know, it's easy for us to stand up here and say, you guys need to do a better job. It's not clear how much better can be done. But my big thing is it's not a priority. We're still pushing enforcement statistics and these traffic stops and stuff. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, Dennis,
Laura Robinson, by the way. She's great. Go ahead.
It was a terrific talk, a terrific paper, which we got to see ahead of time. And I just really applaud you for stepping back and thinking so deeply about this breadth of issues.
Yeah.
And I think that that's extraordinarily helpful, not just for academics, but for those of us who are really looking at policy and at change in the practical sense of things. And I was also very happy at the end that you talked about hiring, recruitment and hiring.
Yeah.
Chuck Ramsey and I, and a few of you in the room heard me say this many times, have always said that the one issue we regretted we did not address in the report for the president was that issue of recruitment and training. It's obviously so essential.
Yeah.
To think about who's going to be making up policing 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. Who are going to be the leaders in policing in 20, 25, 30 years?
No,
that was
yeah.
very important.
Yeah, we can do better at that, and how we sell the recruiting. You know, don't have just people jumping out of helicopters with, you know. There's other ways of selling it. So getting different people to apply. I'm always impressed with those people who get degrees and then they start being a police officer at an older age. It's like, you know, they're 35 or 40 and I want to be a police officer. So, of course, some academics, there's stories of them criticizing police and the officers in their class that why don't you become a police officer and see how you feel? And he says, okay, I will. And then he ends up writing a book saying, it's much harder than I thought. He's, yeah, anyway, yeah, no, that's a really, that's a good point. And the cultural thing, what bothered me, I guess is this being recorded? It is, okay. A large police department where I did a lot of training. At the first day of the training, recruits, their first day, I gave a long talk to them about some of this stuff, and they were like, no, this is great. We love this. How can we get involved? I said, well, you're going to be trained in some of this stuff. And we did do an experiment that was published showing beneficial effects at the end of 6 months. But when you look at the data carefully, I should draw this on a board, they say we're significantly better than the control group, random assignment. But they were still losing ground on all the key measures about how the cynicism toward the public and how important it is to use force against people all the time, no matter what. We had all these questions to set them up, And so here they are at the beginning, and the group we treated, they went down like this in 6 months. The only benefit was that the control group went down faster. They both lost ground. They beat them at the end. But they both, and then the last day of training, I went in to talk to them, to give them the surveys and stuff. And instead of them all like little kids raising their hand, saying, this is exciting, we look forward to it, they're all sitting there like this. And in their uniform, it's like, now, why do we need to talk to you again? Who are you? And what's the point of this survey? It's like they hadn't even hit the street yet, but they had all a totally different mentality. All right. So anyway, any other questions? Yes,
Maybe
of course.
Sorry.
Of course.
Maybe just a quick comment.
Yeah.
Related to the concept of empathy, I think another psychological concept that could be relevant here is emotional self-regulation,
Mm-hmm.
right? You want
Yeah.
people who are very good at toning down the
Yeah.
level of their immediate
Yeah.
emotion.
Yes.
And there's a lot of research showing that affects all aspects of your life,
Right.
happiness, success. It's very hard to respond with procedural justice when you're mad
Right.
and overwhelmed by the compliments you just received from the citizen.
Right.
And I don't know any research that tested
Yeah.
the effects of emotional self-regulation abilities on good policing.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming
Well-
that that's a very interesting avenue to approach.
Yeah, I'm sure anyone's police officer here can tell you that the police have at least acknowledged that, and that can lead to escalation. And they have training a lot of times. And part of it's built into their policy, when you're dealing with especially a potentially violent situation, back up, buy some time. So that's kind of related. But again, and then they talk about, take some deep breaths, yes, that's all good stuff, but that's not good enough training for me. I want to, and measure their level of arousals. Hell, my wife carries a watch around that tells her how great she is all day long and how much she's run and what her heartbeat is. I'm sure some of you have those. There it is right there. Well, you can tell people's arousal levels. Let's see if you can keep your arousal below this level when I put you in this situation and call you names and say, so we could do better with the training part. Did you want to say something? No? Okay, thought you were about to say something. I think we're done. Thank you. That was good.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. So thank you all for being here and listening to Dr. Rosenbaum's presentation. I talked about the importance of this series being the Ideas in American Policing series. I want to emphasize the word ideas because that's what this is about. If you look back at all of the ideas in American policing papers that have been written, all of them propose something different, a different way of thinking, a different way of acting, a different way of building strategies or engaging. And that's why this series is so important, because it pushes us. It challenges us to think in different ways about the things that we deal with every single day, whether you're on the front lines, whether you're doing research or doing something else. So this is what this is for. And this is such an important series for us to continue to have these challenging thoughts and ideas, some of them provocative, which is great. We need that. We need to think differently. We need to be shaken up a little bit so that we can get out of that mold that we're in of saying that won't work. That won't work. We've tried that. That won't work. So these, when you look back at some of these, really look at Larry Sherman's paper in 1998, where he talked about this idea of evidence-based policing. He worked hard to lay out what that strategy was, what it meant, and how difficult it would be to implement. Today, it's secondhand. We talk about evidence-based policing as if it is the way it's supposed to be. He was talking about it in that day of something new, something different. So that's what this series is all about, and that's why this is so important to us here at the National Policing Institute. So with that, thank you all again. I hope you'll stay for a little bit longer. I think we have refreshments just outside. If you exit here right and walk to the end past the kitchen, on the left-hand side, there'll be refreshments there. Is that right? Great. So thank you all very, very much. We appreciate you being here, Dr. Rosenbaum. Thank you again.